Wonderful. Well, welcome. Thank you all so much for your patience. I'm Dr. Bing. I'm the director of the LGBTQ plus Resource Center. We are joined by some lovely folks in person as well, so I am going to try and look at you occasionally. But thank you also very much for joining us. Tonight, we are joined by what I'm going to lovingly call a cousin to Virginia Tech, Nima Vashia, Dr. Ha of the Asian Cultural Engagement Center, and some amazing people this evening. So we're going to have some really great things. There will be a reading, a little bit of a Q&A and some moderated conversation, but I will quickly get out of the way and hand it over to Dr. Ha of the Asian Cultural Engagement Center.
Hello, good evening, everyone. I am going to start with the land acknowledgement. So Virginia Tech acknowledges that we live and work on the Tutelo and Monacan people's homeland, and we recognize their continued relationships with their lands and waterways. We further acknowledge that legislation and practices like the Morrill Act of 1862 enabled the Commonwealth of Virginia to finance and found Virginia Tech through the forced removal of Native nations from their lands, both locally and in Western territories. We understand that honoring Native peoples without explicit material commitments falls short of our institutional responsibilities. Through sustained, transparent, and meaningful engagement with the Tutelo and Monacan peoples and the other Native nations, we commit to changing the trajectory of Virginia Tech's history by increasing Indigenous students, staff, and faculty recruitment and retention, diversifying course offerings, and meeting the growing needs of all Virginia tribes and supporting their sovereignty. We must also recognize that enslaved Black people generated revenues and resources used to establish Virginia Tech and were prohibited from attending until 1953. Through inclusivity, the institutional and individual commitment to ICOSM that I may serve in the spirit of community, diversity, and excellence, we commit to advancing a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive community. And without further ado, I want to introduce Luke Stanley, who will actually be facilitating the Q&A, but also introducing our guest speaker tonight. Luke Stanley was raised in a mixed race family with an Indian mother and white father. Growing up, he spent a lot of time with his father's family, which hails from Dublin and New Bern, Virginia. He's currently a sophomore at Virginia Tech studying biological sciences and minoring in philosophy, while also serving on the board of queer and trans people of color. Luke.
Hello, I'm Luke. I'm going to introduce Nima Avashia real quick. So Nima Avashia is the daughter of Indian immigrants and was born and raised in southern West Virginia. She has been an educator and activist in the Boston Public Schools system since 2003 and was named a City of Boston Educator of the Year in 2013. Her first book, Another Appalachia, Coming Up Queer and Indian in a Mountain Place, was published by West Virginia University Press in March. It has been called a timely collection that begins to fill the gap in literature focused mainly on the white male experience by Ms. Magazine, and a graceful exploration of identity, community, and contradictions by Scalawag. Now to Nima.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Luke, for that introduction. And thanks to Drs. Bing and Ha for putting this whole event together. I'm so excited to be here with you all, even if it is kind of in this hybrid space. I'm appreciative of you for coming out on the evening, and just wanted to say that this is especially exciting for me because Virginia Tech is actually the first college that I ever visited. My uncle was in graduate school at VT in the early 80s. He studied food science there. And so the first college campus I ever visited was Virginia Tech, when we would go to pick him up in Blacksburg and drive him back to our house over the border in Charleston, West Virginia, pretty like every 6 weeks. So I have a lot of early childhood memories that were formed on the campus where you all are right now. And it's really lovely to kind of be back in connection with a community that that was such an important space for my family. You know, my uncle is the first person who I saw go into higher education, and he used to bring his like glossy like food science magazines home on the weekends for us to like look at and read together. And so I feel like a lot of my early education in many ways was sort of being influenced by what he was learning at Virginia Tech. So it makes it especially meaningful to be here with you today. You're also my neighbor in a lot of ways. As you all know, you're not that far from the West Virginia border, sitting in Blacksburg. And I feel like the connection between Virginia Tech and Appalachia is one that I really appreciate and that I'm glad to sort of be able to be in conversation with. Like Luke said, I wrote a book that came out this March. It's called Another Appalachia: Coming Up Queer and Indian in a Mountain Place. And you can see on the cover, sorry for the blurriness, but my family is on the cover of this book. And a big goal that I had in writing this book was to kind of subvert the narrative that exists around Appalachia, which is that a lot of people see Appalachia as a space that is white, Christian, and working class, and straight. And I kind of wanted to push back against that narrative a little bit and say, well, those things might be true for some people, but they weren't true for me. And they weren't true for a lot of the people who I grew up with. And so what would it look like to kind of tell us a different Appalachian story? Not to say that one replaces the other, but just to put another one into the sort of conversation or mix around like, who is an Appalachian? Who makes up Appalachia? Like, how do we think about those questions? And I think those questions are still really relevant right now. I don't know how many of you are football fans, but recently West Virginia University played Virginia Tech a couple of weeks ago. And even in the context of that rivalry, some pretty ugly stereotypes were leveled at West Virginia. Stereotypes about how, they were going to buy toothbrushes for the fans of West Virginia University because the assumption was that people in West Virginia, don't have teeth or don't have good dental health care, or like a lot of pretty intense negative stereotypes that are really rooted in classism and in just sort of reductive ideas about who lives in this place. And so I think it's a conversation that we continue to sort of need to work on in terms of complicating our understandings of who is in Appalachia, who lives there, what are their identities, and how do we have empathy for people who might sort of exist in a space that's different from the one that we're in. So I'm going to read you 2 essays, and then Luke has a bunch of questions to ask, and I'm hoping you'll have questions to ask after hearing these essays. And we'll just kind of go from there. The first essay is called Be Like Wilt. And Wilt in this essay is Wilt Chamberlain. So I'm going to read it to you now. I stand on the foul line at the Cross Lanes Methodist Church gym. I am 9, the only girl playing on an all-boys basketball team, the only brown kid on a team of white boys. My puny arms, thick glasses, and long oiled braid set me even further apart from their wiry, muscular bodies and cropped blonde haircuts. Why has Carl Bradford chosen me for his team? I wonder about this. His sons are 2 of the quickest, highest-scoring players in our local league. In 1988, in Cross Lanes, West Virginia, there is no designated league for girls. And when I try out one Saturday in October, there are only 2 other girls in the gym with close to 80 boys. Tryouts in this pre-hyper-competitive era involve dribbling up and down the court and shooting 2 layups and a couple of foul shots. Every kid is guaranteed a space on a team. The question is simply which coach will choose to take them on. Each girl is selected for a different team. Some teams have no girls. Mr. Bradford doesn't have to pick me, but he does anyway. In doing so, he also takes on the responsibility of chauffeuring me to and from practices and games. Basketball is not a sport my immigrant parents understand, and the parental time commitment it requires is not something their lives leave space for. By opting to play, I take a step further away from my nuclear family and closer to my West Virginia community. Still, my Indian genetics make me short, weak, and terribly uncoordinated. When I shoot the ball overhand, it falls short of the basket by several feet. When I play defense, my teammates say I look like a praying mantis, my hands weaving in front of me instead of out to the sides. I love the game, but I'm about as far away from a natural talent as my parents' hometown in India is from this gym at the end of Frontier Drive. One evening, Mr. Bradford proposes that I shoot the ball a different way. Not overhand, as I've been trying to, but underhand. Granny style, my teammates disparagingly call it. Some of the greatest basketball players of all time shot underhand, Nima, Mr. Bradford says. Wilt Chamberlain shot underhand. His blue eyes, magnified by round wire-rimmed glasses, probe mine. In my adult life, I have listened to entire podcasts about the accuracy of the granny shot and how Wilt Chamberlain scored 100 points in the one game where he shot free throws underhand. And Rick Barry's career free throw percentage was a chart-topping 89.3 because he opted to do the same. But at age 9, I feel like this is yet another way in which I'm being set apart from my peers. Raised by fathers who were players of the game, taught to play at driveway hoops as soon as they could walk, they can shoot overhand. I cannot. How do you assimilate into the dominant culture when your own culture is so invisible to the majority? My small group of Indian peers and I answer this question in different ways. The only Indian boy at my elementary school, who all the white kids either think is my brother or insist I should date, speaks with an exaggerated twang, drinks heavily through high school, and loudly votes Republican later on. Some of the Indian kids who live in the city of Charleston emulate their wealthy white classmates, picking up tennis or golf as entry points into American culture. As for me, I choose basketball. I play the sport constantly, watch it obsessively on the TV in our basement, and rock my satin, turquoise, and purple Charlotte Hornets jacket daily. And not simply because I love the game. I do, but basketball is more than just a sport to me. It's my way into a world where I otherwise don't seem to belong. I blush hard at the suggestion to shoot underhand, dribble a basketball against the white linoleum flooring of the gym, and stare at the black curve of the key instead of making eye contact with Mr. Bradford. I know he's right, but I'm not sure I can find the courage to shoot granny style in a game where all of my teammates and classmates from school will be watching. Much later in his career, Chamberlain explained why he only shot underhand for one season and reverted to the less accurate overhand free throw afterwards. I felt silly, like a sissy shooting underhanded, he said. I know I was wrong. I know some of the best foul shooters in history shot that way. I just couldn't do it. Even though I haven't heard this explanation in 1988, I struggle with the same sentiment. Eventually, however, my desire to make a basket overwhelms my fear of judgment. Game day comes, the point guard gets the ball into my hands, and I position the ball between my legs before hurling it upwards. Swish. It isn't a buzzer beater. It's not the game-winning shot. It's just 2 points scored midway through the third quarter in a regular season game. But the entire gym erupts in cheers, the crowd chanting my name. Someone even calls my mom from the payphone in the corner. I grow so dizzy with this temporary but overwhelming sense of belonging that I fail to register the final score. After the game, Mr. Bradford gives me his slow, sweet smile. See, Nima, it doesn't matter how you shoot the ball. It just matters that the ball goes in. Mr. Bradford drafts me for his team each of the next 3 years. At the end of my last season, he persuades all the coaches to jointly award me the league's Heart and Hustle Trophy, given not to the most talented player, but to the most dedicated team member. It remains to this day the award I cherish most. When I age out of his league, he recruits me as an assistant coach for his younger son's team. His red Jeep Cherokee is a fixture outside our house at least 3 days a week as he continues to drive me to and from practices and games. Each evening after practice, we drive over Goff Mountain. The headlights of the Jeep cast the only light on the dark and winding road that takes us past a pungent chemical landfill and through a dense stand of trees. Close your eyes now, he commands as we approach the summit of the mountain. In the back seat, the boys and I giggle and grin, close our eyes, take a deep breath. Mr. Bradford hits the gas and we soar over the first hill, our stomachs dropping roller coaster style. The Jeep bounces hard onto the concrete, then takes flight again as we hit the second decline. For this brief moment, we are Bo, Luke, and Daisy in the General Lee. Our screams of delight replace the sounds of Dixie in this reimagined Dukes of Hazzard, and I am wildly, freely American in a way I can never recapture outside of Mr. Bradford's presence. Thanks. All right, so that's one. And then the second one I'm going to read to you is called Present Life Hair. All right, here it is. Present life hair. My mother says the hair we're born with isn't our own. It belongs to the person we were in our past life. So what does it mean that my first head of hair, the soft, bronzy black ringlets of my toddlerhood, is still her favorite? Once shorn, as dictated by Hindu ritual, to release the old soul and make room for the new, the hair that grew back on my head was darker, coarse, and frizzy. It tangled easily, and my mother's efforts to untangle it each week, sans conditioner, a product yet undiscovered in our immigrant household, brought me to tears each time. We were strangers in West Virginia, the state where my parents decided to make a home. Strange because of our immigration status, strange because of our anomalous brown skin in an astoundingly white state. My parents could not control much about how the world would receive my sister and me. The racism, the xenophobia, the sheer ignorance about our culture and faith. But what they could control, they did. Our appearance. Keeping our heads down, being well-groomed, not standing out any more than we already did, they thought, would keep us safe. My parents required us to dress up in church clothes to go to the dentist, the ice skating rink, or the mall. The first time my sister wore jeans with holes torn at the knees, my father's response was, I didn't move to the United States from India for my children to dress the way poor children do on the streets of Bombay. And when it came to the subject of our hair, the worst comment my mother could make about us was to say that our hair looked lagrajeva, which is to say, wildly unkempt. The message was clear. A good Indian girl was docile and feminine. My older sister conformed to this standard for much of her time at home. But I, the typical second child in many ways, began to push back early. Played basketball starting at age 6, watched football alone in the basement on Sundays, refused to wear dresses the minute I was old enough to express an opinion about my clothing. Hair quickly became the only point of control my parents had over my gender expression. My regulated hair represented my regulated self. I'm ashamed to admit this, but my mother combed my hair all the way through 6th grade. I struggle with spatial reasoning and with fine motor skills. Thus, the skill of braiding down my back eluded me. It eludes me still. Each morning, I sat on the peach carpet in her bedroom while she perched on the edge of the bed behind me. She slathered her hands with oil, worked it through my locks, and then pulled my hair into the tight, waist-length braid that can be seen in most photographs from my childhood. To this day, I can't cook with coconut oil. The smell it releases when it hits the pan and begins to warm, the white congealed lump slowly transforming into clear liquid, reminds me so viscerally of hair. Long, thick, black, rope-like hair came to symbolize femininity for me. My mother had that hair. My sister had that hair. My grandmothers, my aunts, my cousins, my West Virginian Indian aunties all had that hair. Every Bollywood actress in the black and white 60s and 70s films we watched in my house growing up also had that hair. Nargis, Madhubala, Shabana Azmi, these gorgeous curvy women with dark eyes and heart-shaped faces all had dark hair parted down the middle and plaited all the way down their backs. Their dance scenes in white, rain-drenched saris were my first introduction to what it meant for an Indian woman to be sexy, to be the object of desire. They defined beauty, they defined womanhood, and they felt so far away from the woman I felt myself becoming. When middle school started, I was no longer willing to be dependent on my mother and became desperate to fit in with my peers. I announced my intentions to my parents, then walked from my house to my shop hair salon a few blocks down Big Tyler Road the week before school started. I asked them to chop off my braid, taking my waist-length hair up to shoulder length, and to give me bangs. My parents refused to pay for a perm, or I probably would have ended up with one of those too. In my 7th grade picture, I exude all the awkwardness of adolescence. Glasses, braces, a silk shirt, and hairsprayed bangs puffed a full 2 inches out from my forehead. There's a palpable desperation evident in the photo, a need to find a place for myself in a world where I didn't really fit. Crosslands, West Virginia in the early 90s was home to maybe 7 Indian families total. In my middle school of 600, no more than 10 of us were not white. And my mother's definition of beauty, the one I learned as a child, held no meaning in the halls of Andrew Jackson Middle School. My best friend at the time could not have been more opposite of me. She was Mormon, all arms and legs, with blonde hair that flowed halfway down her back. Even on mornings when we had volleyball practice at 6:15, she woke early enough to wash and blow dry her hair, put it in curlers, let it set, then shake out and hairspray the living daylights out of it. Her hair, her ice blue eyes, and her pert, turned-up nose made her the queen bee at our school, the standard that all the other girls aspired to. One that I, brown and bow-legged, with my weird hairsprayed bangs, knew I could never reach. But maybe, I thought, being proximate to the object of every boy's desire would somehow make me more desirable. I watched her execute her morning beauty routine after sleepovers. I envied it and also knew it was something that would never fly in my household. Not the hairdryer, not the curling iron, not the makeup, not the 90 minutes of beautifying before leaving the house. My classmates' ideas about beauty, based on the country music singers and Hollywood stars of the day, revolved around pale skin, light eyes, light hair, features that were a biological impossibility for me. No matter how big I made my hair, how tight my jeans, how shiny my boots, I was never going to look like Reba McEntire or Faith Hill. And trust me, I still have the cowboy hat in a box somewhere to prove that I once tried. What then was I supposed to look like? If neither the beauty standards of my classmates nor those of my mother and her beloved Bollywood stars felt like the right ones, then what models existed in the world for me? My hair came to symbolize this effort to figure out who I was supposed to be in the world. What look was right for me in a world where the looks that existed simply didn't seem to fit? If you were to flip through an album of photographs of me between middle school and now, you would see that I have had my hair at every possible length and cut in every possible style since that first cut in 7th grade. Page boys and ponytails, pixie cuts and bobs, and at some low moments, haircuts that range from looking like a mushroom to a mop to a mullet. Yet none of these cuts made me feel desirable or desired. Beyond appearance, deeper questions also tormented me. Who was I supposed to desire? Who was supposed to desire me? Many of my white classmates were of the opinion that I should date the only Indian boy in our class. But he and I grew up together, slept at each other's houses, treated each other's parents as our own. This idea bordered on incestuous. I, meanwhile, thought I was supposed to desire the clean-cut, football-playing, all-American boys who ended up being homecoming king. The ones who were kind to me and not hurling racist epithets, but who ultimately saw me as some kind of asexual being, existing outside their schema when it came to dating and desire. I didn't date in any serious way until I was 30. I tried half-heartedly, went on lots of first dates with dorky Indian boys I found on online dating sites, but never found a relationship that fit. In large part, I think, because I was still trying to heed the mixed messages about gender and attraction I absorbed growing up Indian in West Virginia. Until I realized that the reason neither my mother's beauty standard nor that of my West Virginia peers felt like the ones I could fit into was because I didn't. I didn't conform to the gender norms of either of those cultures, not in my clothing, not in my mannerisms, not in my way of being, and not, ultimately, in my decision to spend the rest of my life with the woman I love, instead of with the man I was expected to love by both of those societies. In 2015, I cut off my hair for good. After 35 years on Earth, I finally settled on a hairstyle that feels right to me, even if it doesn't look like anything my Indian family or my West Virginian peers would ever condone. I've gone to see my sweet Colombian stylist, Luis, every 5 weeks for the last 6 years. Each time I sit down in his chair, he begins by asking, "So, what do you want me to do this time?" And each time I answer the same way. "I trust you." When he puts his hands in my hair, there is none of the discomfort I associate with those childhood braiding sessions in my parents' bedroom. Instead, there's this incredible sensation of freedom that fills me. Like me, Luis is queer. He has no expectations of what my hair should look like or what I should look like. His only goal is that I feel good about how I look. And when I'm done with the session and he spins me around in the chair to get a look at my head in the mirror, for the first time since those past life ringlets, I actually do feel good. I look cute. My hair looks sharp. These are not words I ever used to describe myself growing up in West Virginia. My hair is short and cut close to my head, a spiky crew cut when it's at its shortest, a pixie cut with a stubborn cowlick shooting up from my scalp at its longest, with salt and pepper streaks at the temples that are increasingly more salt than pepper. During the pandemic, I even took this look one step further and let Luis give me a faux hawk that he then dyed a deep burgundy. Occasionally, when I'm walking in Jamaica Plain, I'll see a younger woman dressed like me, in a t-shirt and jeans, with short hair and a gender non-conforming swagger, and my heart will skip a beat. Because suddenly, I'm not alone in this style. There are more of us. And through our very existence, we make the existence of more of us possible. We become our own Shabana Azmis, our own Reba McEntire's. There's still pangs sometimes, though. Moments when I feel as though my decisions have put me at odds with my culture and family. When I look at photos of myself from weddings and see the combination of sari and short hair, I, like my mother, feel that it looks weird. My hair does not mirror the flowing locks of Nargis or Madhubala or my mother or my sister. My hairstyle doesn't fit, and neither in those moments do I. I wish sometimes that it had been easier to default into my mother's definition of beauty, to wholly embrace that Indianness, that notion of femininity, which feels most like home to me, even as I don't feel fully at home within it. Indeed, the sweetest memories I have of time spent in India are still those when I sat on the floor, braced by the shins of my umamami or my manjufoy, and played with the folds of their saris while they worked oil through my hair. I haven't been back in 7 years, and I still find myself missing that connection, that intimacy. But every time I visit my 14-year-old niece, whose long hair rivals that of her mother's, she will inevitably snuggle up beside me and run her hands through my short hair, form it into peaks, and then smooth it down again, scrunch her fingers through it and massage my scalp, get rubber bands and clips and style it into ridiculous tiny ponytails sprouting from all sides of my head. I don't have to ask. She does it in a way that feels both habitual and intentional. As if to say that my hair, though not like hers or her mother's or her grandmother's, is still enough. That I, her short-haired Masi in this family of long-haired women, the only of her Masis married to another Masi, am enough. Thanks. All right, I'm happy to take questions from Luke and from the rest of you. Please feel free to throw them all at me.
So I have a couple prepared questions to start off with, and then we can open it up to everyone else. So the first question is, in your book, you talk a lot about the differences in coming out to your Appalachian community and the Indian community you grew up in, to your parents and the other Indian families in your area. And so I wanted to ask, when coming out, was there one aspect that was more difficult or stressful in each situation? Like, was there something that stands out as when in each situation?
Very much so. I think what made them different for me a little bit is that I think I worried more about conditionality of love with my Appalachian family. Like, I think I felt really worried that, and I think this was probably a combination of race and sexuality that was playing out, but like, I think I felt worried that like their love for me was predicated on me fitting into their expectations of who I was supposed to be. And that like, if I moved outside those expectations, I wasn't sure that that relationship would be able to sustain itself. And in a way, I felt like I didn't have that same fear with my Desi family. Like, I knew that I wasn't like, and this doesn't mean this doesn't happen for other people. Like, there are some people for whom like that question with their family is really a question of like, is my relationship going to continue to be sustained here? I didn't feel like that with my parents. I felt more like I really was worried that like they weren't going to be able to imagine like what my life would look like. And that like their sort of constructs around happiness and what it meant to be happy were really upended when I came out to them. And like I then was going to have to sort of like be really intentional about helping them to understand that happiness can look different ways. And that just because it wasn't going to look like their definition of happy didn't mean that I couldn't be happy. So I think in that way, like I wasn't as fearful in terms of my Desi family relationships of like of a fracture, but more like of like the work that then laid ahead in terms of sort of like what I was going to have to do to teach people. Whereas with my Appalachian family, I was just more fearful of like fracture, of like this is gonna be a determining factor in like whether these relationships continue or not. So it did feel different in that way.
And my next question is similar or related. It's, what advice would you give to someone in a similar situation to you as a queer child of immigrants dealing with the difficulties of coming out to two different communities with varying cultural experiences and contexts?
I think my biggest piece of advice would be to give yourself a lot of grace because this is hard. And like, and we need to be our biggest ally, not our biggest enemy. And sometimes I think where we make it so hard on ourselves, like we turn a lot of our anxiety back on ourselves. And what we like the best thing we can do is kind of extend grace to ourselves because grace is in short supply from other people. So like there's enough of that, not grace in the world. We don't also need to not have grace with ourselves. So I think just one is that. I think two, National Coming Out Day was last week, and I was thinking a lot about that. Because like I think sometimes for people whose identities aren't quite as complicated as I think some of the folks in this room might be, like coming out is this thing you do and you do it and then it's done, right? And I think when you live across spaces, like coming out is a thing you're navigating all the time. And it's work and it's this constant sort of like calculation and decision making that you're engaging in of like, what am I sharing with who, when, and how? What is that going to look like? What are the risks involved for me in that situation? It can be really exhausting. It's not like a one and done. It's like a perpetual negotiation that you're in, and that can be really, really hard. And so I think in addition to having a lot of grace with yourself, the second piece is I think to find some folks who share those experiences and those elements of your identity so that you're not doing that by yourself, and so that you have a space where you can kind of go back to and be in community with other people who can be like, yep, like that I can resonate with that experience, or like here's how I negotiated this, or here's where this happened for me. And like I'm so grateful that you all have the space there that you have. Like that space didn't exist for me when I was in college. And even the fact that this is an event being held across two spaces, right? Spaces of both like, what does it look like to be LGBTQ, and also what does it look like to be Asian American? And like we can hold both of those things together. That conversation about intersectionality, I feel like is so important and wasn't there in the same way 20 years ago when I was in college. So I'm grateful that the space exists, and I think really leaning into that space and like letting that be a space that supports you would be the other piece of advice. I think finding your people is like the best thing any of us can do. And if you can find your people, it can really help you navigate a lot of hard things. The hard's not going to go away, but it's a little bit easier to navigate when you have some support.
Yeah. That's definitely a big thing, having like community to like interact with and support you and then help you through it all and to back you up if things don't go out how you want them to.
That's right. And sorry, I just have one more thing that I was just thinking about, if it's okay if I say it.
Go ahead.
I think that also like something that's taken me a really long time to learn is that like in some cases I've had to like really reduce my expectations of people. Like I might have wanted them to be certain ways towards me, but what they've shown me again and again is that they clearly are not able to. And so what I can do in that situation is be like, okay, like I'm going to reduce my engagement here, right? Like I don't have to sever with you necessarily, but like I'm going to reduce how much we're interacting, or I'm going to take some step back from this. I think when I was younger, I think I wanted sometimes people to be able to change, and some people do, and some people show you that they're not going to. And so being able to sort of make some decisions within yourself and build some protection around yourself to be like, this person who's showing me that they're unable to make the changes I need them to make, like I'm going to take some space from that relationship. I think it's a really important gift that you can give yourself to say like, I'm going to invest in the relationships with people who see me for all of me and love me for all of me. And those are the places where I'm going to put my energy and my time. And if someone can't do that, I'm not going to put my time there, and I'm not going to like keep investing and expending energy in the direction of a relationship where I'm not getting anything back. I think I spent a lot of time expending in a direction that like ultimately wasn't going to change. Right. And so if I had that time back, I'd be like, go where people already love you instead of trying to make people love you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you mind if I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Just about what you were saying. I was curious about what would you consider factors in terms of like how you can see someone changing their opinion as opposed to getting to your expectations. Because I know certain people in my life, they take a very long time to reach the expectation that I am hoping for them. And of course, it feels incredible. So I'm just wondering if there's any factors or things that you can see in a person's actions that makes you feel as if they're making an attempt to change.
It's a really good question. I mean, I think about my mom a lot, and my mom is really trying to make meaning, and I can see it, right? She often says things that I'm like, oh my God, this is you are using all the wrong words, and I didn't know Nima wasn't normal when she's growing up, and I'm like, ah, but my partner reminds me that while my mom doesn't have the right vocabulary, she is turning ideas over in her head. She's thinking about who I was as a young person and maybe things that she didn't know or didn't have schema around. I can see her brain working, right? For me, that's important. It can be hard in those conversations sometimes. It doesn't mean that I don't end up having feelings sometimes about the awkward and uncomfortable things that she says, but I know she's in an active process of trying to accommodate who I am as an adult into her whole view of me, right? That it's not just about, oh, I can accept you as who you are right now, but she's actually trying to do the work of being oh, this has actually always been a thing about you, and I need to contextualize this as part of who you've been the whole time. That for me feels really important. I think that is, I think for a lot of our parents, that's actually a lot. The ability to do that is more than I feel a lot of people are able to do. So that I think is probably the best example that I've seen of sort of someone. I've also had the experience of I've been doing a bunch of these readings, and a couple months ago I did a reading at a queer feminist bookstore in Boston, and a queer they see woman came, and she brought her parents with her. And her parents came to the reading, and it was it was a awesome structure. I read, and then people were in small groups doing discussions, and her parents were talking about their experiences and talking about their process of sort of understanding their daughter, and then also their conversations with other Desi peers of theirs of being all right, you can get on board too, right? And if you can't get on board, then we don't need to engage anymore, right? So that kind of from parents to be you can take my child as she is, or you can peace out, but I see my child in this, and I value and hold her as all of who she is. That those things I think are really positive signs. I think those are also people who are further along in their journey. I think just the idea of is the person willing to be in conversation with you? Are they seeking to understand you, or are they just seeking to convince you of something that they're not going to be able to convince you of, right? Those are different orientations. Is the conversation a learning conversation? Is a conversation that's seeking to understand? Versus a conversation where it's very clear that they have an opinion, and all they're doing is trying to make you have their opinion. I think being able to distinguish that a little bit for yourself is helpful. And I also think there are some relationships where I really have had to take a lot of space. And I think a thing that I try to say a lot is we live in a time when canceling and severing are kind of the way a lot of people function, right? I am done with you. You did X, I'm done with you. I think it's possible to hold space without severing. I can say, I need a lot of space from you. It doesn't mean I'm done with you for the rest of my life necessarily. I can check back in at another point when I feel emotionally I can do it, and see where you're at. And if you've made some growth, okay, then we can engage a little bit more. And if you have not, then I can step away again. But I think giving yourself permission to do that is really important. I haven't been back to India in 8 years. I haven't. I used to go all the time. in the context of my family and also the political context of what's happening in India around Hindu nationalism and like very strict and narrow definitions of like who counts, it doesn't feel safe to me to go there, right? That doesn't mean I'll never go back. I don't know. There might be some time in the future where it feels different and where it does feel safe. And like I'll leave myself open to that idea. But I also am like, I'm not gonna do that right now. Like there's too many levels on which like me making that choice right now feels not safe for me, feels like it condones policies and politics that I'm not okay with, that some of my family is espousing. Like it's not a choice I'll make right now. But maybe there's some point in the future where things will shift and it'll be possible again, right? So that's, I think, the other piece is just giving yourself permission to say, like, I control how much I engage. And I can make decisions about how closely I engage versus like, is this a time when I need to take a step back and take some space? Does that answer the question? I don't know if it does.
Thank you. I appreciate
Okay. Yeah.
it. Can I also ask another question?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering, you grew up in West Virginia, and so you said that you mostly grew up around like white families and stuff like that. Does any part of you kind of wish that you grew up with people with more of your culture, that kind of thing?
That's a great question. I had a really unique experience, which is that so my day-to-day of like the neighborhood where I lived and the school that I went to were incredibly white. But in the greater Kanawha Valley, there were about 100 Indian families. And so like my weekends were like full of Desi people, right? So I had this weird dual reality happening where it was like, yeah, school was really hard. School was very racially isolating, very violent at times. But I also did have moments or opportunities on my weekends to like be in spaces that were like where I was reflected in lots of ways, right? Where like the people around me, they spoke my language, we were eating our food, we were in that cultural context together. So I think I'm appreciative of having both of those experiences. I do think that a lot of my questions around racial identity would have been easier to navigate had there been more of us around. I think when I talked to like my Desi friends, there were like very few of us who grew up kind of in this experience. And I think what I know is that like basically we were all struggling, but we were all struggling by ourselves. I don't think we were able to see outside ourselves enough to know that like, oh, you're also having a hard time and you're also having a hard time. I think we all just thought we were by ourselves with our hard time. And I think maybe if there was like more of a critical mass, we would have known that we were all having a hard time and it would have helped us to both support each other and think about like, well, what are we going to do about this? I think in the absence of that mass, like you just individualize everything. And so I think it took me a lot longer to sort of come to like a strong analysis of what was happening because I didn't have enough people to kind of be in that conversation with.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Right. And we have a couple questions in the Q&A section on the whole setup. I don't know what these are called anymore.
You're doing great.
Question. So would you tell us more about the phrase "in a mountain place" in your title and why it was important to you to include this phrase?
Yeah. I grew up in a mountain place. Like I grew up in the mountains where I lived, like where you look around, there are mountains everywhere. And I think I only became really aware of that after I left and wasn't in a place where there were mountains anymore. I live in Boston on the like 2 miles away from the ocean, right? And I'm very clear that geography shapes identity. And I think being here has only made that more clear to me. Because when you grow up in the mountains, like it's really hard not to be humble because mountains are humbling. Like you are small and you look around you and the mountains are huge and you always have that sense of scale. You always know how small you are relative to the world. And in my sort of like 20 years of being on the coast, I don't think people possess that humility. I think it is really easy for people to think they're real big. and have outsized egos and outsized opinions about like how much they matter, because there's nothing reminding them of how small they are. And so the mountain place for me is the cue to that like awareness of smallness. It's the awareness of like, I am one tiny being in this very big world. Like mountains remind you of that all the time, right? And so I felt like it was important for me to cue to that in the title, because part of what I really am trying to cue to in this book is that like I don't believe in definitive texts. Like, right, there's a way in which this book is kind of viewed as like a clapback to this book Hillbilly Elegy, which was written in 2015 by J.D. Vance. And Hillbilly Elegy was really held up by people as the definitive text about Appalachia. It was on the New York Times bestseller list for 53 weeks. Even today, if you ask people about Appalachia, if they've never been there, a lot of them will tell you, oh, like I read Hillbilly Elegy and I think I know something about Appalachia because of that. That book says nothing about Appalachia that's meaningful, in my opinion, right? But like I wasn't trying to write another book like that one. I was trying to write a book that was like, here's my really small story about this really small place and this really small community. But I can interrupt your brain in what you think about Appalachia and who you imagine is Appalachian by telling this small and specific story, right? And so I think that mountain place idea is about like smallness. It's like, this is a very small story about a small person. But that is where I think the learning is that like, we have to really be more attentive to small stories and not let like big explainers be the thing that we allow to like form our opinions about people or place. Because we're living in a time where like really flat narratives are very polarizing, and people think they know who someone is or a region or a space. They think they know because of this one story they got about it. And I actually think the only antidote to that is a bunch of small stories being like, nope, this is more complicated. It's more complicated. It's more complicated. It's more complicated. Like, you're never going to know it unless you look at all those small stories.
I think that's really interesting, actually. And when I first started looking at your book, I was actually very interested that you had chosen the words "a mountain place," because not to distract or anything, but my uncle wrote a book about Appalachia called The Poco Fields, an American story of place. And so I think it's very interesting, like how much in Appalachian culture, like geography and community shape the identity of the area.
That's right.
And
That's
like
right.
who they are.
Yeah. I think any book that you read by an Appalachian writer, like place is a character in the story. Like people are just very aware of their relationship to place. And it's really interesting because so much of the rest of America is divorced from their relationship to place. Place is seen as expendable. Place is seen as like, nah, I can go here, I can go there. It doesn't matter where I go, right? I am not bound to place. And in Appalachia, it's like, no. Place makes us. We are made by place. Is a very uncommon idea in this time, but I actually think it is it's a really important way of being and thinking, because when you're not bound to place, it's a lot easier to let bad things happen to the place where you are. When you don't see your connection to place, then destruction of that place doesn't hit you in the same way. But when you're really rooted in a place, you know when people are poisoning your air and your water, and you feel it and you fight it. So I think there's a way in which we are encouraged by capitalism and like exploitation of resources to divorce ourselves from place. Because if you're divorced from place, we can exploit the place, we can exploit the land, and you won't say anything. But I think Appalachian people like really are resisting very hard against that idea.
Yeah. And, you talked about the Hillbilly Elegy, and that's a lot like, one of the big problems is the idea of needing to leave a place and not. Yeah.
Yes.
All right. So, we going to some more questions in the Q&A section. How is your relationship with other non-white / non-Indian students?
Like in terms of my work as a teacher, I think this maybe is this person is thinking about. I could say maybe.
It's not specified, but maybe if the person is still here, they can send another message into the Q&A to specify.
I don't want to answer the
Um,
wrong thing.
Yeah. And I actually had one last prepared question, which is
Sure.
kind of on similar lines about teaching. And it's, now that you are a teacher, how do you incorporate different parts of your identity into your classroom? And what is one thing that you learned from your experiences growing up that you want to impart to your students?
Yeah. I really lead with my identity as a teacher because I feel like if I'm going to ask young people to take risks and share who they are, I can't ask them to do that without being all of who I am. And so I really lead with that. And I think that it means that it does give young people permission, I think, to share like what they're navigating or what they're grappling with in a different way. Because I talk about like my journey, right? And they've read some of these essays. They kind of know different pieces of like what my experience has been. I'm also really transparent about the fact that I'm the child of immigrants, and I talk about the ways that I think that shapes lots of things about how I move through the world. And many of my students are the children of immigrants themselves. So that's kind of a shared space. But I think that like the biggest learning for me in my work with young people is that like, you know, growing up, I didn't have mirrors. Like there was no Desi representation in books or media. And when there was, it was Apu from The Simpsons, right? Like that's what I had. Like, or Fisher Stevens pretending to be Indian, or like the stupid Indiana Jones movie and the Temple of Doom. And then like, you know, every kid at school is like, does your family eat monkey brains? And I'm like, I hate everyone here. This is like not okay. But this is what I have for representation. And I would rather have none than have that, right? Like, so
Yeah.
that's the context I grew up in, was like no mirrors. And you're just kind of like, my therapist, like we talk about it as like bushwhacking. It's like, I don't know. I'm just like, it's the woods and I'm just like trying to cut things down and figure out like, I don't know where I'm going. I'm just cutting. And if I cut enough, maybe I'll make a path. Right. That experience makes me really mindful in my work with young people of how important it is for people to have mirrors, because bushwhacking is hard and exhausting. And like, it's not, I don't wish it on anybody. I don't want people to feel like they have to bushwhack. I think we can make a path. And like by offering someone like, here's a path, you don't have to take it. You can go another way, but there is a path. And maybe if you start down that path, it'll help you figure out your path from there, right? I can clear an opening, and then that maybe helps you to figure out where you want to go from there. It just has made it so I feel like so committed to the idea that young people need mirrors. They need books and media that show them different representations of like who it's possible for them to be. And in some ways, we're living in a really good time for that. Like there is more representation in like a surface way, but like deep representation, I think we're not there. You know, like I think Hollywood has learned to put like brown people and Black people on the screen, but like the nuance of those experiences is often not there. Like that show Bridgerton, it was like, oh great, you have some Desi women and they're like mixing up languages and like cultural, it was like all they were was like brown, and like the cultural specificity wasn't there, right? So I think with young people, like the work that I'm trying to do is like, how do we get you the mirrors that really align with your experience and that are authentic mirrors, that aren't just mirrors being made by someone to make a profit, but really are mirrors that like resonate with your experience. That's kind of what I feel like I try to think about with them.
Yeah, that's huge. Well,
You want to switch?
yeah.
Yeah. This is so high tech, y'all.
Yeah.
This is great. I have two questions before we officially conclude. One is from the Q&A. Have you found your community, and if so, how did you do so?
Yes and no. So I think that like, even I'm 43 and like, I think it's a process, right? Like I think I live in Boston and there are lots of white queer people here. Finding queer people of color, finding queer people of color who sort of like share this like mix of experiences that I have of like growing up in Appalachia, that's like impossible. And I think there's like two of us. But so I think I find like moments or like spaces where I'm like, there's some connection, but something I think I experience is like sometimes when I find a space where there's like a lot of representation of one part of my identity, that's also the space where the other part of my identity becomes most salient. So it's like, oh, I'm around a lot of queer people, but like all of a sudden, like my Appalachianness or my thissiness is like really flaring. And I'm like, how's this happening that every time I find one space where I could belong, another part of my identity is like, no, you don't really belong here. I think that's like an evolving process. And I think it's in part why I write, right? Is like in a way, like I feel like I write to sort of like both create that belonging in myself and also extend that sense of belonging to other people. Because there are queer brown people in Appalachia, and like, you know, they're reading this book now, and I think that's like a community I'm sort of like finding as I go.
I love that. I love the idea of having an identity flare up.
Yeah.
Feeling like I just feel really Midwestern right now and
Yes.
just not being seen. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's amazing. A question that we try and ask every speaker when we ask them to come and talk about their identities, because so many times we talk about our identities, or when we're taking up space in like a very hegemonic space, such as like a university campus, we talk about so much about detriment. We talk so much about struggle and all these different things. We often don't give folks the opportunity to talk about just the things they absolutely love. So my question to you is, what is your favorite thing about being a queer person who grew up in Appalachia? A queer and Indian person who grew up in Appalachia?
I think my favorite thing is that like I really love being unexpected. Like I get a lot of joy out of making people's brains do gymnastics, right? That like when people encounter me, they're just like, I don't know, you don't fit in any box. There is no box that we can put you in. I like that. I like disrupting people's understandings of place, and I get a lot of joy out of it because it's like, you know, like it's like a win for counter hegemonic moves when you're like, all right, yeah, like your ideas about normal, like they don't work anymore, like I bust them, and I just am going to keep busting them everywhere I go. So I think that can be a hard thing, but it can also be a source of a lot of joy to know that like your existence upends people's understanding, and I like that.
I love that. You have dropped so much wisdom on us this evening. We are so incredibly honored. I just want to say thank you so much. And I'm sure we have a round of applause for you. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much for having me. It was so lovely to be in space with you. Thanks for your great questions. And please feel free to reach out. I'll put my, well, I don't know. Yeah, you can, I'm on all the social media, all the things. Feel free to find me. Feel free to send messages. If you have a really frustrating conversation with a family member and you're like, I need to scream, you can send me a scream message. I will gladly read it and send some empathy and appropriate emojis your way. But yes, y'all are, you know, like you just are like doing exactly the right thing, which is finding like the most authentic expression of who you are. And just know that like that's like the most important thing you can do. So I'm really appreciative to you for being in that work and doing that.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. And thank you to everybody who joined us this evening, whether you're in person or online. Have a great night, be safe, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Good night, folks.
Night.
Good night. I'll be back.